Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. Today is October 7th, 2020, and I'll have you out of here before the vice presidential debate. If you want to watch that this evening, I'll have you off in plenty of time. I thought I'd dig back into the archives and go to some of my roots with some of these broadcasts. This is an old broadcast that I've updated recently, but really it forms the foundation of an idea out of Vogue, an idea in wilderness therapy, an idea that you get taught. What I love about existential therapy and existential philosophy is that so many kinds of therapies are built on its foundation. There is in the therapy field things like reality therapy that really lend themselves to existential therapy or borrow from the principles. If you've read the book by the Arbinger Institute, they talk about agentive theory. Agentive theory is a modern idea, but really, again, it's rooted in existential therapy. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about and referencing a few times Viktor Frankl's work. There are two books at Evoke that we asked to be a part of our regular curriculum for our students. There are lots of assignments, lots of books that students are asked to read. But two of the standard books are, one is The Knight in Rusty Armor by Robert Fisher, a wonderful allegory about the therapeutic journey that we all go on. And the second one is Man's Search for Meaning, which both tells the story of Dr. Viktor Frankl's time in a concentration camp, but also outlines the therapy that he developed, the model that he developed, in part as a result of the things he went through in the Holocaust in a concentration camp. So with that, let's get into it. I took a couple of liberties. This was the quote I was trying to draw from the other night when I was doing the question and answer by Albert Einstein that says, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. I really, really love this quote. I'm going to say it again. No problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. For the idea out of Vogue, the idea in this kind of therapy that we do here in this kind of psychoeducation is for all of us to evolve beyond our context, to not be paying attention to the content and the specifics of the question of the problem at hand. If somebody, for example, the example I've been using with our staff lately is that if you've ever met somebody with anorexia, for example, and they tell you, let's say a woman who's 5'6" and 95 pounds, sharing with you some disgust and self-hatred over how fat they feel. And I think intuitively, even if you haven't had that experience, that explaining to them typical, normal medical guidelines for body mass is not going to solve the anorexia. It's not about weight. Similarly, it's not about behavior. Similarly, when you think about parenting work, the parenting work that you're doing, and I talk about this all the time, I get asked questions all the time. What should I do in a given situation? But that question can't be answered because in this way of thinking, there's no should. There's no right way of doing or being. It's more about authenticity and honesty and courage and love, things that have a quality to them far beyond the ideas of simple right and wrong. Like I talk about in the audacity to be you, the shift is from being right to being a self. So when we look at mental health issues and we try to address the problems in the context in which they were created, with the same kind of thinking, or as Einstein suggests, the same kind of consciousness that they were created, we're really just running around the same track over and over again. So we have to get out, we have to get above. We have to see something on a different level of complexity, of abstraction. And the reason I bring this Einstein quote up is, number one, because I love it and couldn't find it on Monday, but also because today we're going to be talking about something that's highly philosophical. This is not going to be, although I'll make a couple of references to skills, this is not a skill-based broadcast. This is about a sensibility. I use that word a lot, a way of being and relating to the world, relating to yourself, relating to your own life. This quote from Campbell I thought was also a nice precursor to the body of tonight's work. Viktor Frankl said, or excuse me, Joseph Campbell said, life has no meaning. Each of us has meaning and we bring it to life. It is a waste to be asking the question when you are the answer. So Joseph Campbell's idea is that this life is the meaning of life. Living is the meaning of life. And that there's nothing more complex about that. I love this last quote, this last story, I should say, before we get into the body of tonight's work. A master composer once finished playing a piano piece before a royal court. I believe it was Beethoven. This is a story from Beethoven, but I wasn't sure and didn't look it up beforehand. But anyway, finished playing a piano piece before a royal court. And as he finished, somebody from the court asked him, what does it mean? And to answer the question, Beethoven sat down and played it again from beginning to end. That you make meaning out of it, right? It is what it is at a basic level. The meaning is self-evident. So let's get into the body of existentialism and Viktor Frankl's logotherapy tonight. As a foundational understanding of existentially based therapies, we'll start with this. Instead of regarding human experience as such as anxiety, alienation, and depression as implying the presence of a mental illness, existential psychotherapy sees these experiences as natural stages in a normal process of human development and maturation. In facilitating this process of development and maturation, existential psychotherapy involves a philosophical exploration of an individual's experiences, stressing the individual's freedom and responsibility to facilitate a higher degree of meaning and well-being for his or herself in his or her life. So many of the people that do this work already know that this is true. You already know that through therapy, through education, through this process, that some of your pain, your angst, your anxiety is well-founded. It's well-founded because there were things taught to you by the culture, by your earlier contexts. There are things with your children that are real, ideas like ultimately you cannot control them. So part of existentially based psychotherapies is to say, we're not simply going to try to get rid of the anxiety. We're going to listen to the anxiety. You'll recognize this because I talk about this all the time with children's behaviors, that we would be wise to consider the behavior and what it's trying to tell us before we go about trying to change it. Somebody recently shared with me that they were having a recurring negative thought, kind of a self-sabotaging thought, and they wanted to get rid of it. And I just paused for a moment and said, let's go back into this thought process, this fantasy that you were indulging in your mind, and let's explore it and what feelings were in that fantasy. And yes, those fantasies, those behaviors have led to problems in your life, but maybe they can let us know what's missing, what you're looking for, why those old behaviors were so attractive to you. And we simply explored and unfolded it, and it made sense. This individual was looking for an experience that these fantasies represented, that these fantasies offered some kind of escape for her. So this idea is, I want one more example before I move on. Some of you, it's a popular TED Talk or YouTube video, so that's why I make reference to it. But there was a couple of lines in Brene Brown's first most famous TED Talk, the one that really brought her on the scene. And at one point, she was describing, she said, my therapist, she said, I thought I was having a mental breakdown. And my therapist described it as a spiritual awakening. Now, the feeling is unpleasant, But what the therapist was trying to tie into is this uncomfortable, overwhelming anxiety that you're feeling, this discomfort that you're feeling is really breaking the shell of your understanding into this new level of consciousness. So as you go through this and part of what family systems therapists, that is therapists that are trained in family therapy models, part of what they talk about in the kind of work that we do with children is that the child, since the system is the object of observation, right? It's not the individuals in the system, but the system itself. So then the child represents this signaling from the system that something isn't working. And then because you're loving, dedicated parents who don't want to see your children suffer, you go on a quest to find out what it is. And initially your quest is, I'm going to go on a quest to find the balm, right? The healing thing that will bring peace of mind to my child, that will take away their symptoms. But of course, what you find is a kind of peace and clarity and calmness, because you see things differently. You understand things differently. Like Einstein mentioned in that first quote, you've moved beyond your current consciousness, your previous consciousness, and you're understanding things very, very differently. And so old ideas, old interactions, old conversations at a dinner party are meaningless and shallow to you. Some more from the philosophical side of existentialism. Man is nothing. I apologize for the use of male pronouns and male figures here. A lot of these are quotes from philosophical texts, and I pulled them out, and they used man in previous decades a lot more than they do today. Man is nothing else but that which he makes of himself. This is the first principle of existentialism. In other words, we don't go out looking for the meaning of life, we create it. I thought this was cool. I use this in The Audacity to Be You. I use this quote from Joseph Campbell. He talks about in The Power of Myth, which is a great book that it's edited from a series of lectures that he did with Bill Moyers just before he died. You can find it online streaming in various sources, The Power of Myth. But at one point, Joseph Campbell says, we look back on our life, and at this point, he's just months before his death. We look back at our life and all the situations and circumstances, the seemingly happenstance decisions and circumstances now have been woven into this beautiful, beautiful embroidered kind of blanket, tapestry, he calls it. And we look at it and it all makes sense and it all fits. And I think that experience that we have of looking backwards and making meaning, out of things that have happened leads us away from the existentialists' idea, leads us to believe that there is meaning inherent in the experience. People that say, I wonder why this happened. The existential therapist will say, what do you think? What are you going to do with it? What meaning have you made out of it? Based on that meaning, what are going to be your actions, your actions in life, your choices going forward in life? So it's not a meaning to discover. It's not defined by something or somebody else, but it's something that you create. Ultimately, it's the freedom that existentialists would refer to as the anxiety of freedom. That nobody is out there telling you the way that it should be or the way that it is. I'll tell you just before I get into it about couple of existentially led groups. First of all, in graduate school, we were going through various group therapy approaches, and I forget if we were assigned or if we chose them, but I ended up with existentialism. So what we were supposed to do with our cohort, I had about 15 people in my cohort during graduate school, is we would go in and we would kind of play out group therapy. One week I would be the group therapist, another week Somebody else would be the group therapist, and on and on and on. And then you were supposed to use your model. You're supposed to study it, know it, and use your model. So I had existentialism, existential therapy. So I studied it, was fascinated by it, was really attracted to it. So, and by the way, the interactions weren't necessarily real therapy. You were allowed to role play. You didn't have to disclose anything to your academic peers. But I went in there and I sat down, and basically the person who was starting the class said, "Okay, Brad's in charge. Therapy is starting." And I just sat there. And after a while, people said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "What do you think we should do?" And then people started getting frustrated, and they said, "We have to learn this subject. You have to say or do something." And I'd say, the choice is really yours. You can do, what would you like to do with this time? Then somebody would say, "Well, that guy over there is not paying attention." And I would say, "Do you want to invite him in? What would you like to do about that?" And you can imagine, after about 15 or 20 minutes, the group was completely furious with me. They were beyond agitated. They were angry, raising their voice. There was a mentor in the group that was supposed to be overseeing the class, and he pulled me out and he said to me, "You have to do something." And I said, "I am doing something. I'm doing what an existential therapist would do." He said, "Well, they don't understand." I said, "I know." And you can see what's coming up for them as they're feeling a lot of anxiety and anger that I'm not taking over, that I'm not setting the frame and telling them the way that it is. And he said, "I understand, but you still have to do something." So I went in, I said, "I'm going to explain this to you for about 2 minutes, and then I'm going to go back into my role, the role that I was assigned to do." I've tried that in the group, in the wilderness, many times. I've tried that with parents during parent visits. When I do it with the group, even today, I've done it as recently as my latest field visit. I just sit down and I say, "Okay, let's call a group," and I just wait for people to bring up what they want to, talk about what they want to ask questions if they have them, to share. Maybe they're thinking about a girlfriend or boyfriend at home. Maybe they're thinking about a letter from their parents. Maybe they're curious about me, and we just kind of go with it. But I will tell you, and I've been fascinated by this, that about half of the time, the clients in our program get angry. And their anger is that nobody's telling them what to do. Nobody's taking charge. And ultimately, I'm saying, and they'll say to me afterwards, "Well, I didn't know the rules." And I said, there were no rules. I didn't make any rules. I just opened the group. So existential angst, existential anxiety is what arises when we have lost an authoritative idea about what our life should be, how our life should be lived. Existentialism, it says that it's your responsibility, and that anxiety that occurs when a person wakes up to the idea that what their life is up to them, what meaning is made out of it is up to them, that nobody else defines it, the culture doesn't define it, the religion that they grew up in doesn't define it, no therapist defines it, I don't define it, the program doesn't define it, that there is a lot of anxiety, and in the cases that I shared with you, anger. What existentialists have in common is that they believe that existence comes before essence. Man, first of all, exists, encounters himself, surges up in the world, and defines himself afterwards. To begin with, he is nothing. No matter what he is made, no matter what is made of one is always responsible for what one makes of what is made of one. Philosophers, of course, they have to make the wording just a little bit more complicated to impress us with their intelligence. But the idea is that you get to decide. And existentialists that are committed to the idea of existentialism believe not only do you get to decide, but nobody can decide for you. If they do, you are taking kind of an easy way out of your existential dilemma. Define a few terms. Good faith is when one takes responsibility for one's choices, right? Yes, this happened to me, but how I deal with it is my responsibility. Bad faith is blaming others, blaming my choices, maybe not my feelings. I'll pause for a moment to take a detour because feelings are a strange kind of middle ground. One doesn't choose one's feelings, not consciously at least, but one's background and belief system, um, as it interacts with circumstances, creates the feeling. So over time, we can choose feelings, but it would be inaccurate to simply say that feelings are a choice. But within the context of existential therapy, we would say how you feel about, for example, your child's struggle is ultimately your responsibility. What you do with it is your responsibility. You are in charge of your life, the way you're living your life. I love this idea. I think about this all the time from a quote from somebody, an author I respect, who wrote a book on the shadow, and she said, I began to think after years of therapy and searching for gurus and philosophy, I began to consider for the first time that I was the reason. The way I was living my life was the reason that I was unhappy. Good faith is owning your choice. Bad faith is blaming the quality of your life, your choices, on the circumstances. And transcendence is your ability to overcome it. It's I think transcendence is maybe the most fundamental idea in spirituality. Transcendence means that the facts don't define me. The circumstances don't define me. One of the reasons why I love, and so many people love, Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, is this, I think, is because um, Viktor Frankl was in a concentration camp and still ultimately came up with the idea that what you make of one's life is still your responsibility. Now, if Viktor Frankl had been privileged, people would be right to respond with, well, I had it worse than you. Many people could say, I had it worse than you. But when you're in a concentration camp and your family is separated and ultimately murdered, and you're around torture day in and day out, nobody gets to say to Viktor Frankl, yours wasn't so bad. So the fact that somebody, even in such a tremendously painful, tragic situation, can ultimately respond with, what you do with your life is your responsibility, I think is what makes it so profound. Facticity and existentialism is the facts, the things, the objective things that happen to you. I'm saying this hypothetically, somebody rear-ended me today on the freeway. I got laid off from my job, right? My child came in from school crying. My wife asked for a hug, whatever it is. The facts are not in question. So transcendence means that we go beyond the facticity, the facts of our life. And then authenticity is this kind of ability to live one's life in good faith. I gave a few examples. I usually, after I teach this to students, I ask them for some examples because I think people get confused, again, about good and bad faith. Statement number one, I drink because of my job. What's that an example of? And the example is, it's an example of bad faith. I am unhappy because of my child's issues. What is that? That's an example of bad faith. My children make me happy. Another example of bad faith. I became a lawyer because my mom was a lawyer. Bad faith again. If we were to turn those into good statements, statements of good faith, it would say, I experience a lot of stress at work, and the way that I cope with it is drinking. When I watch my children hurt, I feel so connected to their pain. My empathy is I'm so in touch with my empathy that it hurts me to watch them. If we were to change the statement of "my children make me happy" into a statement of good faith, it would be, I feel really happy when I watch other people succeed, especially my children. I'm so close to them. And I do that because I love and care about what's going on for them. And I'm just excited for them. See, there's choice. There's I statement in it. There's taking responsibility for even the context and the interpretation of things. My mother became a lawyer. My mother was a lawyer, and she seemed to love her job. So I thought that might be a good idea for me to follow it, since we're the same kind of personality. So it's not, good faith and bad faith isn't defined by the pain or the sadness or the joy of it. It's by the responsibility. And the reason why this is so important, not just for your children, but for you, is because existentialist philosophy suggests that you can have serenity in your life even when circumstances aren't so peaceful. Ultimately, the branch of therapies that would be considered existentialists at their core is that you're responsible for yourself. You're responsible for your well-being and for your happiness. It's not that everybody's at the same starting gate. Obviously, some circumstances are more challenging than others. Some contexts, some trauma are greater or lesser than others. All of that is true. But ultimately, you take responsibility for your life. When I describe the idea of ownership versus choice with feelings, I often say, let's say hypothetically I had been physically abused by my father, which is not the case, but let's say I had been. And an acquaintance comes up to me and pats me on the shoulder, and I flinch in fear. It wouldn't be accurate to say that I chose to be afraid of his raised hand as he was going to pat me on the shoulder in a friendly manner. But it is my fear. I didn't get to choose my father physically abusing me in this example, but I get to choose what I do with it. I can go to therapy. I can work on it. I can wade through the trauma and the painful healing that comes with it, or I can remain a victim to it. I can remain a victim to my circumstances. So existentialism doesn't say that everybody has the same privilege, not at all. Existentialism recognizes the objective idea that everybody experiences more or less advantage or trauma in their life. But the existentialist idea is ultimately you're responsible for it. In reality therapy, they talk about choice constantly. That's an existentialist-based therapy. Talk about that it's not what happens to you, it's what you choose that defines whether you have peace, serenity, and joy and happiness in life. I've already shared with you the idea when I hold the open groups at Evoke with children and parents that not only do people feel anxious and uncomfortable, some are tickled by it, by the way. Some love watching it happen, especially the quiet ones. The ones that are more okay with quietness, the more cooperative ones often get a kick out of it. The ones who are constantly pushing against boundaries, they often react the most elevated because they don't, yes, they react oppositionally to boundaries, but they need to know what those boundaries are so they know what to push against. It's about ownership. Insight is important in existential therapy. Right? Insight is seen as a driving force for behavior change. Accountability, a word that maybe the most beloved words by parents that there is. Accountability, responsibility. And without shame. There's no judgment on this. It's just what is. In fact, the existentially based therapist would be very non-directive, would have very few opinions for you about what you should do. I have this principle that I talk about called reverse accountability. And reverse accountability is this idea that I invite for students to look at look at your circumstances, look at where you are in life, and assume that this is where you want to be. And I'll tell you the example that I use to illustrate this. Somebody's knocking at my door, so you're going to get to hear my Rhodesian Ridgeback welcome them to the door right now. I would do this as an exercise with my students. I've always struggled with food and body image and those issues. One of the ways that I medicate is with food in my life. So at various times I would ask students, I would say, I would tell them my weight. This is how much I weigh. I'd tell them the exact number. And then I'd say to them, how much do you think I want to weigh if you could guess? And they would look at me, and some of them would want to be polite. But almost never did they guess the weight that I just told them that I was. And what I would say to them is, let's say I weigh 230 pounds. I would say, I want to weigh 230 pounds. You know how I know? Because I weigh 230 pounds and I don't have a medical issue. I used to say I would do anything to be in shape except for exercise and eat right. I used to say I would do anything to play guitar except for take lessons and practice. But during the pandemic, I fixed that one, taking guitar now. I would do anything to learn a second language except for study and practice. Existentialism makes the person responsible for the now and the going forward. So reverse accountability, I would say, is, do you not want to be in wilderness? In fact, I would join students and clients with that hope, with that need. I would say, if your goal is to get home, I'm actually really good at getting people home. If that's what you want, let's talk about what it takes for you to be back home or back at college or back in high school. Let's talk about that. Reverse accountability, this is a phrase I made up, is looking at where you're at in life and taking responsibility for it. Taking responsibility for the quality of your marriage, for the relationship you have with your children, for your career. There's a great moment in the wonderful, wonderful movie that I recommend to everybody, Finding Joe. You can get it on Apple, through your Apple device, or you can get it even on YouTube. I think it's free right now during the pandemic. Finding Joe, a film by Patrick Solomon. But there's a wonderful moment in there where Gay Hendricks, an inspirational speaker and author, is talking, and he said he slipped on a patch of ice and hit his head and kind of had this semi-conscious realization. And I won't describe it all, but he said, I realized that I was living a life that I didn't want. I was in a job I didn't want, in a relationship I didn't want, and in a body that I didn't want. That's an existential crisis moment. And really, I think what our children can offer sometimes is that same kind of moment. When we accept the reality that we can't control our children and we love them so much, we have to, as Einstein suggests, evolve to another level of consciousness, because we can't solve the problem inside of, I don't want them to be using substances, combined with the reality that I can't control that, combined with the reality that if they are happy, I'm happy. If all those things are true, I'm stuck. So I have to find another level of consciousness. That's why in Al-Anon and in Families Anonymous and in our teaching, we say and repeat the slogan, the idea over and over again, that your serenity is your responsibility, not your child's. That's an evolution in consciousness. And if that idea can become true, then you're not held hostage by the other circumstances, by your child's struggling and suffering. And in fact, the beauty of that is, psychologically speaking, is you actually start to contribute to the systemic, the patterns, the behavior in a more helpful way. Some more key concepts. Self-awareness. Task is to illuminate existence. Anxiety is a positive. It awakens us to the inauthenticity of being who others want us to be. Existential anxiety is that idea that we wake up to our own life. In Finding Joe, Um, one of the president of the Joseph Campbell Foundation says, we become the hero of our own lives when we stop being the victim of our own lives. That's the title of my first book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is that. I try to make it as practical as possible, but ultimately it's transcending the ideas about parenting and relationships that most of us were taught. Neurotic anxiety is a different idea from a different philosophy. It's seen as part of a mentally unhealthy person's makeup. But existential anxiety is not. You know, reminding clients that they cannot escape their freedom. I say often to everybody that I meet with, I point out that this adage that has really been a liberating adage for me, which is you don't get to win. You don't get to be right, and you don't get to win. You get to choose how to lose. And you get to be a self. You get to be who you are. And that might not be popular with everybody that you hope it will be. And people, we don't like that, right? We want rules and formulas. I was teaching my staff today in our staff supervision session. I was saying to them, we can't manualize therapeutic assignments. There aren't enough words to tell somebody how to respond to every single client's and student's behavior. It wouldn't even make sense. You can't manualize this thought process, but you can hear stories, you can hear examples. According to Joseph Campbell, that's what the myths are there to teach us about. Myths or Campbell's idea of God is it's a different level of consciousness. Campbell says that one of the mistakes that people make about prophets is that they think that they're talking about history. Excuse me, they're talking about the future or history. And while there are some parallels, what he suggests from his philosophy, his very existentialist philosophy, is this idea that they're trying to teach us about a different way of thinking. The prophets, he says, they see the world vertically in layers. They don't see it horizontally, past and present. The wonderful Buddhist monk who just died today, I believe, today or yesterday, Thich Nhat Hanh. He talked about this idea that we can have peace in every step, in every moment. And he had people coming to him with the most horrible set of circumstances and facts. And through his own approach, which has existential ideas in it, a Buddhist philosophy, he says we can find peace even in the context of the circumstances. So reminding clients that they cannot escape their freedom. I remember one student said to me at one point during a very upset moment right after he read his first letter from his parents. And I was gently but clearly holding a boundary with him. And he said to me in tears, his name is Jimmy, he said, "You've taken away all of my freedom except for my choices." And I said, "Say that again?" And he repeated, "You've taken away all of my freedom except for my choices." And there it was. There was this existential blockage. He equated freedom with control, actually. Control of circumstances and others. And he didn't know freedom was a deeply spiritual principle. Oftentimes in existential therapy, there's a struggle for initiative. And what that looks like is the client wants to be told what to do. The client often comes in thinking there is a formula for therapy. There's a formula for my life. I'm going to plug into somebody who's done the research, develop the knowledge, who can kind of give me the guidelines, the rules, the solutions, can kind of upload the manual to me orally in our sessions. People ask me all the time, what are my assignments? And sometimes I'll say, well, you might read this and you might read that. But since I come from somewhat of an existential place, the response is, I often say, I won't follow up. You don't have to do it. You don't have to do anything. So existential discomfort in early stages of therapy is that the client wants the therapist to take charge, and the therapist is giving that back to the client. The therapist is creating a small kind of miniature context that replicates the idea of an existential universe. That existence happens first, and then we make meaning of it afterwards. Therapists encourage clients by invitation to take a stand for themselves. In the example I gave you earlier, when I was running the class, the existential group therapy class, and people were complaining that some people were checking out and walking away, I would say to those participants, I would say, what do you want to do about that? Is there anything that you would like to do with those circumstances, that situation? So that's the idea of challenging clients to take responsibility for their own lives and their own decisions. Who are you? Why are you? What are you choosing, and why? Why not? To grow, we must learn to leave the familiar and secure for new unknown places. I think this is a great moment. I think the best depiction of psychotherapy that I've ever seen in popular entertainment is in Good Will Hunting with Robin Williams, and he won the Academy Award for it. And Robin Williams comes in to meet Will, and basically that's existential therapy. And it comes to a head when Robin Williams says to Will, what do you want? And Will simply can't answer it. I say that to students also. What do you want? Parents, what do you want? And then once you state what you want, then we talk about if it's possible. If you want to control your child's behavior, we can't do that. If you want to find ways in which you might be contributing to it, we can talk about that. If you want to find ways to exit the dance, we can talk about that. To the clients, to your children, when they say, I want to go home, I want to be free, I want to make my own choices, we can talk about the ways and the means that people get to that place in life. Man is responsible for and must actualize the potential meaning of his life. He sees freedom and responsibility as two sides of the same coin. When he spoke to American audiences, Viktor Frankl, was fond of saying, I recommend that the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast be supplemented by a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast. Frankl's most enduring insight, one that I've called on in my own life in countless situations, forces your control, can take away everything you possess except one thing, your freedom to choose how you will respond to a situation. Forces beyond your control can take away everything you possess except one thing, your freedom to choose how you will respond to the situation. You cannot control what happens to you in life, but you can always control yourself. And on the cover of The Journey of the Rogue Parent, I use this quote from Frankl that says, when we are no longer able to change the situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. And Frankl loved to quote Nietzsche, who said, he who has a why to live for can bear almost anyhow. Frankl called his therapy logotherapy or logotherapy. When speaking with an analyst, Frankl was asked to define the difference between psychoanalysis and logotherapy in a sentence or two. The analyst stated, during psychoanalysis, the patient must lie down on a couch and tell you things which sometimes are very disagreeable to tell. Whereupon Frankl immediately retorted with the following improvisation. Now, in logotherapy, the patient may remain sitting erect, but he must hear things which are sometimes very disagreeable to hear. Frankl was challenging of bad faith. He would point out, essentially, in gentle ways and through invitation when somebody was taking a victim stance, when somebody was behaving in bad faith. I love this idea around happiness. I think it's key to think about this in terms of how you think about your children, but also to think about it how you think about your relationship with your children, the peace and serenity or lack thereof that you feel in relationship to your children. This is Frankl's idea on success and happiness. Frankl said, don't aim at success. The more you aim at it or make it a target, the more you are going to miss it. For success, like happiness, cannot be pursued. It must ensue. And it only does so as the unintended side effect of one's dedication to a cause greater than oneself, or as the byproduct of one's surrender to a person other than oneself. Happiness must happen. And the same holds for success. You have to let it happen by not caring about it. I want you to listen to what your conscience commands you to do and go on to carry that out to the best of your knowledge. Then you will live to see that in the long run, I say, success will follow you precisely because you had forgotten to think of it. Think about throwing a baseball or a football or a tennis ball. And imagine if you were trying to aim it through, say, a tire that was hanging from a tree. But all the stakes in the world were riding on this toss. Think about how nervous you would be. And most people's instinct, because of born out of fear, is to kind of try to aim it, right? To really kind of concentrate and try to aim it. Those of you who have played sports, tennis or baseball, or tried to shoot a basketball, those of you who are artists will know what they talk about when they talk about flow, where it's not a conscious thought. What you learn in from sports and from art is you have to let go. You have to just throw. You have to trust your motion and your mechanics. If you aim, which is really a word for control, if you aim too much, you'll lose all of your control. In fact, one of the ways to illustrate the truth of this statement that Frankl suggested about success and happiness is, if you really want to be happy, take heroin. And just take it until, of course, you die, because that's where it will lead you. But if you have enough money and enough heroin, you'll be happy until you die. It'll be a short journey. Or drink. Or eat whatever your heart desires. Or have sex with whomever you want. Right? Whenever you want. Do everything that just pleases the senses and distracts you from the existential anxiety that you feel. I mean, that's what your children are doing. They're trying to be happy. And they don't know that there's something richer and more meaningful than pursuing happiness. And what they will find, just as you will, is if you don't seek to be happy, but you seek to make meaning out of your life, then happiness will come, success will come. If I get nervous in tennis and I try to aim it, I lose all of my power. If I relax and trust my swing, I have all my accuracy and power back. Ideas about freedom. Most of the time we think about freedom as freedom from outside restraints or from consequences. A lot of adolescents, young people, and part of the adolescent brain is they want all of the freedom from outside constraints without any of the consequences or responsibilities, right? That's an immature idea. People that misunderstand freedom associate, and that's most of us, associate blame or shame and accountability as one and the same. I talk about that all the time. Freedom, according to existentialists, comes from the inside out. It's not being freed from prison, but it's being freed while in prison. It's not escaping political servitude, but it's transcending the moment. It's not blaming your life on your idiot parents. It's acknowledging that you have human parents and realizing that it's your job to grow up in spite of them, to grow up and be free in spite of their fears, anxiety, controls, and idiocies. Freedom born of making choices that open doors instead of closing them. You start to make it like as we grow and become more adult, all of us, and I'm not talking about just the adolescent brain, we start to understand freedom more. Most of us still suffer from ideas that confuse freedom and control. Freedom can be seen as a way of thinking about happiness, love, esteem, and joy. Sigmund Freud suggested that the outcome of effective therapy is freedom, and freedom specifically from unconscious obligations. One of the things that I do consistently in therapy with everybody at every age is simply challenge them on the use of the word should, especially when that word applies to the self. And people worry that I'm teaching or reinforcing this kind of amorality, when in reality, it's the only way to find morality. Freedom comes ultimately when we focus on what we can control. I love this poem by Khalil Gibran on freedom. He says it this way: at the city gate, and by your fireside, I have seen you prostrate yourself and worship your own freedom. Even as slaves humble themselves before a tyrant and praise him, though he slays them. I, in the grove of the temple and in the shadow of the citadel, I have seen the freest among you wear their freedom as a yoke and a handcuff. And my heart bled within me. For you can only be free when even the desire of seeking freedom becomes a harness to you. And when you cease to speak of freedom as a goal and a fulfillment. In other words, like with your children, when they say, I will feel free when I get out. You know, for me growing up, and I'm in my 50s now, I was going to be free when I became an adult. And then I was going to be free when I was financially independent. And then I was going to be free when I got married and had children, because that would make me more adult-like. Or when I had a career and made more money. I kept looking for it outside of me. The biggest shift from this and a lot of the philosophies that we teach that are really a part of the recovery for everybody is you can find it now. It's our ideas about life that keep us in chains, and that's what Khalil Gibran is saying. Moving on with his poem. In truth, that which you call freedom is the strongest of these chains, though its links glitter in the sun and dazzle your eyes. And if it is a despot that you would dethrone, see first that his throne erected within you is destroyed. And if it is a care you would cast off, that care has been chosen by you rather than imposed upon you. And if it is a fear that you would dispel, the seat of that fear is in your heart and not in the hand of the feared. You can see and hear the shift constantly is back to you're responsible for the happiness that you have in your life. And when we tell or teach or model for our children that our unhappiness is because of them, we are modeling for them bad faith. We are passing on to them the belief that it will be the circumstances of their life that dictate whether or not they will be happy. And I bet you every single person watching or listening to this would not want to be teaching that to their child. But that is what's happening when we tell our children that we cannot be happy, we cannot rest, we cannot sleep, we cannot find peace until fill in the blank, until they do whatever it is that they need to do or stop doing. Related concept to this in Buddhism, the radical acceptance is that idea of accepting life on its own terms and finding effective strategies to cope with whatever is happening. It doesn't mean being passive, but accepting what is with the understanding that you have the power of choice. It is not a non-judgment self, but emphasizes the choice and the responsibility of what is. The circumstances cannot be denied. We are all living in a pandemic. Our health, our outside freedoms, our circumstances, our careers, our finances are all being stressed in various ways at various levels, depending upon who you are. That cannot be denied. I think what is happening in this pandemic during this pandemic is essentially an existential crisis that is nearly universally shared. Related to this is the idea of internal versus external locus of control. Research in wilderness therapy shows that we make dramatic improvements from external locus of control, which is my circumstances define me and create my happiness or pain or misery, versus internal locus of control, which is I decide. The choices I make determine my happiness. Great athletes, I'm a sports fan, as you might guess from this particular podcast, but great athletes have internal locus of control. They don't say, well, the pitcher just was unbeatable today. They say, yeah, that guy's pretty good. He's got some good stuff. My tennis match is up against somebody really, really strong and talented. But what can I do? So take home. Happiness is your responsibility. Learn to take care of yourself so that you can parent your child with their needs as the focus. Learn to take care of yourself. Be responsible for your happiness and for serenity. Feel and be responsible for your own emotions, and understand how shame, this trickle down experience of shame, is affecting all of us. Focus on what you can control. I mean, that's the serenity prayer. That's AA. That's Al-Anon. Ultimately, we turn our children's lives over to them and let them determine whether or not that they're happy. But ultimately, it starts with ownership. Move to change slowly. Don't be too quick to change and improve, because you might miss some of the lessons that are at play at a deeper level. Cassidy, because I promised that we get done before the vice presidential debate tonight, I'm just going to wrap it up really quick, not take any live questions. If you want information on upcoming intensives, I'm going to be running the one in person in November. I don't run them very often, the Finding You. So if you want a Finding You with me running it, I'll be running the one November 11th through 15th. Go to our website or email intensives@evoketherapy.com. Pursuits adventure trips are outside of our wilderness therapy program. Families, individuals, you can use it for maybe end of program before you go on to the next step. Pursuits trip, just contact Sarah without an H, SARA @evoketherapy.com. We have parent support groups online during the pandemic for both our intensives program and for our alumni. Go to our website or contact Malia @evoketherapy.com for more information. We ask all parents to attend 6 12-step support groups. Follow us on social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. You can find us all there. All these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app. My 2 books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon. And then I'm going to be talking to you next week. Whatever questions, if you can just save them, Cassidy, I'll save them for next week. I'm going to be broadcasting at a special time this coming Monday, October 12th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. So thank you for and on behalf of your children. Thank you for being willing to take your being here tonight is evidence that you're taking responsibility for your life. So thank you for that. I hope this is a helpful point of contact, folks. Take care. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.